It has been a long and challenging journey with many bumps in the road. We believe that mutual respect will gradually lead to the peaceful reunification of China and a system of democracy, freedom, and equitable distribution of wealth.
Welcome to Current Affairs Taiwan. I'm your host, Donovan Smith. With me today is Sean Su, longtime political activist and part of the communications team during the Sunflower Movement. Welcome to the program, Sean.
Hello.
All right, today we will be discussing former President Lee Teng-Hui, who tragically passed away at the age of 97. Dubbed by the media Mr. Democracy, he is considered the father of Taiwan's modern democracy and by some the father of the free, locally ruled country we have today. He is one of the few leaders in history who started with the full powers of an authoritarian state and voluntarily stepped down, leading to Taiwan's first transfer of power to an opposition party. I personally arrived in Taiwan as a teenager during the first months of his presidency. Sean, what are your thoughts on his passing?
I do think this is considered very important. If this were happening in China, the PRC, I think people would be coming out, or North Korea, for example, people would be coming out and crying on the streets. And, the fact that thought kind of crossed my mind, I think, and some others, shows how important he is. Taiwan exists today as a democracy in large part because of Lee Teng-Hui. Even those too young to quite remember his presidency, have been directly affected by, the changes he made in their upbringing. So I do know that the older generation is definitely quite, they have mixed feelings. Obviously, if you're pan-blue, you might not have liked him so much. But I do know that definitely for the pan-greens, he will be sorely missed. I do know many have wished that he could live on forever, maybe be immortal, such as how some British people think Queen Elizabeth will live forever. There's many that would have wished to have seen former President Lee survive to well over 100 years.
Yeah, well, he was older than Queen Elizabeth, so.
Sad, yes. How there's this ongoing joke in the United Kingdom where Queen Elizabeth is actually immortal. I actually felt that, I wish Lee Teng-Hui was basically like that. I would have been happy to see him outlive me, considering the contributions he gave to Taiwan's democracy.
Yeah, I mean, he's always been one of my personal heroes, and I was lucky enough to get to see him speak. And boy, he has an interesting accent. He spoke Mandarin with. It's very weird because he had sort of a Japanese accent and sort of a Taiwanese accent, but the Mandarin that he spoke was clearly studied from those mainlanders who just arrived. So his vocabulary was weirdly mainland China style. And so it was a weird mishmash of accents. It wasn't like a modern Taiwanese Mandarin accent. It's a very unusual one. But yeah, I put him up there with George Washington and Nelson Mandela. He's a really remarkable man, I think.
Perhaps his accent is why he was able to embed himself among the KMT for such a long time without, quote unquote, being discovered for who he really was. One of the things I've heard from friends that speak Japanese very well, or who are part of the Japan-Taiwan Students Associations and so forth, is that they feel that Lee Teng-Hui has a very strong Japanese accent, especially when he speaks Japanese. And of course, because Lee Teng-Hui had quite an interesting life where he grew up under the Imperial Japanese since the 20s. An adult when the KMT came. He did join the Imperial Japanese Army. So
he was an officer.
Yes, he was.
Anti-aircraft gunner, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's get back to his history in just a second. A lot of people expressed their sorrow today and passed on their condolences. One I thought that was quite interesting is from U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He said, "On behalf of the American people, I would like to offer my sincere condolences on the passing of former President Lee Teng-Hui." He said former Taiwan president, which is significant. Lee Teng-Hui. As Taiwan's first democratically elected president, Lee helped put an end to decades of authoritarianism and ushered in a new era of economic prosperity, openness, and rule of law. During his 12-year tenure, Lee's bold reforms played a crucial role in transforming Taiwan into the beacon of democracy we see today. He cemented the deep friendship between the United States and Taiwan. Our thoughts and prayers are with the people on Taiwan, and we will honor President Lee's legacy by continuing to strengthen our bond with Taiwan and its vibrant democracy through shared political and economic values. So I thought that one was interesting. Were there any condolences that you thought were particularly interesting?
Yes, I actually saw the one from President Tsai, although given at this time, I have some difficulty remembering exactly what she said. I don't have the quote in front of me. Do you happen to have that?
I looked at the quote that was in Focus Taiwan, and it was all paraphrased, so I don't have the exact quote.
Okay. Well, I saw a lot of quotes from friends, also including Chi Ting-Ye from Taiwan Media, and again, you have to read his Twitter and Taiwan Media's Twitter, and he had written a really succinct. Of course, he has a way of with words, a rather succinct way of describing Lee Teng-Hui's legacy and. How, of course, all over Twitter, I saw lots of people writing, and not just Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, even Reddit, just expressing how they wished he would have just been around longer. It really does cement the fact that 2020 has been one hell of a year, and we did lose a lot of really good people. Yeah.
Taiwan Media, by the way, I highly recommend all of our listeners to check out Taiwan Media. It's a great outlet. And Ting is the editor there, and he's a great guy. But all right. So getting back to his personal history. Now he was in the Japanese military. He studied in Japan, and he was part of a group of people. They were Marxists, and he came back and he joined the Communist Party. His friends got arrested, but he managed to escape that. Now, that's, I think, very interesting. There are a lot of rumors around that. Essentially, what happened is, there's rumors that he sold people out or these kinds of things, but nobody really knows. But what is known is that he left the Communist Party, and later he was quoted as saying something along the lines of "communists don't understand humanity" or something like that. And he kept his head down. He became, he studied agriculture and I think agricultural science or agriculture in the United States at Cornell. So he was obviously a very well-educated, smart guy. And he was kind of talent scouted by the KMT, and he joined the KMT in 1971. And they moved him up, step by step. And he was spotted by Jiang Jingguo, who was trying to bring in more Taiwanese. And since after 228, of course, a lot of the intelligentsia, the educated Taiwanese had all been killed, there was kind of a shortage of qualified, educated Taiwanese, and he was one of the exceptions. Mm-hmm. And so he was brought in eventually, I believe it was 1980, he became Taipei mayor. After that, they appointed him to the governor of the Taiwan province, and then finally he was brought in as vice president. And then, of course, Jiang Jingguo passed away, and then the presidency passed to him. Now, that period is, I think, really interesting. The period of transition from one-party rule to open elections was a bit touch and go. Many in the KMT were not as keen as he was to move to democracy. So we're talking about the late 80s through the early 90s. So he became president in late January of 1988. And of course, the KMT was still, at least on the national level, was still a one-party state. Martial law had been technically lifted the year before, but there were these new security laws that were basically martial law light. The fearsome Taiwan Garrison Command was still a thing. People were still being thrown in jail for saying, Taiwan should be independent, and they would throw them in jail, although for shorter periods than they did under martial law. There were still a lot of people exiled. And when I arrived, people were very reticent to talk about politics for the most part, because the legacy of martial law and because of the security laws that they just put in, which again were pretty serious. So he came in, and of course there was a lot of jockeying within the party, and he did some really clever things, and we talked about some of this before the show, and you gave, I think, probably the preeminent example in his choice of premier.
Mm-hmm. Lee Teng-Hui appointed the Minister of Defense, Hao Bo-chen, to premier, which was great because it stopped and prevented a potential military coup. And he also did a lot of other things. He outmaneuvered Chang loyalists. They called them the Palace faction. After Hao was fired as premier in 1983. Actually, he did a lot of political maneuvering during this really, I would say, I don't want to use the word chaotic period because of how smoothly he seemed to have control.
It was a chaotic period.
It was a very chaotic period. But I
was here. It was chaotic.
I was in the States. I know a lot of people were arguing back then. Yeah, like for instance, in 1996, a lot of Taiwanese American or even just first-gen immigrants, diaspora from Taiwan, were really aggressively disliking Lee Teng-Hui. But I do remember that towards the 2000s, just 4 years later, their attitude towards him were basically almost flipped around, although he was still technically on the wrong team in their eyes. But yeah, that move with by installing your enemies into, positions of power is a very Lincoln-like move.
Yeah, I mean, I can give some other examples of kind of the things he had to do. So because there was a lot of suspicion in the KMT of him not being pro-unification, he set up the Unification Council to, in theory, move forward a unification agenda with China. But there's two things about it that are quite interesting. Part of it was that basically part of that was it put in some restrictions. In other words, saying that China had to become a democratic country and things like this. Within that meant that it pushed any potential unification further back. And the other thing that was interesting, and I was just reading this today from someone's account, where this was WUFI and some of these U.S. and FOP and some of these other U.S.-based groups, and they met with him, and they were really upset about this. And he basically told them, he said, look, what you need to do is protest this. You need to go out there and protest. In other words, he was working the other side so that it would give him an excuse to make it more difficult to actually have unification, because then he'd say, oh, well, I have to respond to the public opinion. So he would do a lot of things like that. He would do something that would would please the base in the KMT on the surface, but undermine it at the same time. And, I think one of his most genius moves was his response to the Wild Lily movement. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for listeners who are not familiar with it, the Wild Lily movement started in 1990, and it was mostly a student-led thing. Basically, the precursor to the Sunflower movement. And all these students came together, and keep in mind, it was still a one-party state. And And so this was a period that it was still scary. And the national security laws, if they had been actually used and applied in this case, a lot of people could have gone to jail. So there was genuine potential danger here to these students. But Lee didn't use those laws. The students were left alone. So these large protests came out. And then he personally went and met with the protesters. And basically what they were demanding was open elections for the legislature, for a new national assembly, direct elections for the presidency. And he basically, over the next few years, gave them pretty much everything that they had asked for. And one of the most, first things that he finally managed to do was change the Constitution. And he had to get it through his own party, and he managed to do it. They changed the Constitution so that the legislature could be elected directly in Taiwan rather than in China. Because at the time, most of the legislature was made up of these ancient people. They'd wheel them in wheelchairs, and they had colostomy bags and all of this because they'd all been elected in 1947 in China. So they were all representing constituencies in China. And so they'd wheel all these old geezers in. And finally, they got this constitutional change that meant that basically the legislature was almost entirely made up of legislators elected in Taiwan, with a few exceptions. There was overseas Chinese, also had some legislators as well. But basically, so that was a really dramatic shift. And by 1996, of course, he was elected president. And that was a very interesting election because it was the first direct election in Taiwan for the presidency. And by this point, the legislator had finally been locally elected for the most part. So that was kind of the capstone on that transition. What do you remember? What do you think about that 1996 election?
Back then, I was very young, so that's the first thing. I'm still a millennial. We can't, of course, forget about the 1996 missile crisis, which, Lee Teng-Hui maneuvered easily around China. So China had lobbed these missiles into the Taiwan Strait and were telling, the Taiwanese people how to vote, quote unquote. And of course, that is, the third Taiwan Strait missile crisis?
Yeah, the third Taiwan crisis. Yeah, Taiwan Strait crisis. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there was even some sort of tidbit where Lee Teng-Hui told the Taiwanese people to not be afraid, and even mentioned that some of the missiles were dummies, which unfortunately I think burned a spy.
Yes, that was one of the few mistakes I think he made during his presidency. Yeah.
Lee Teng-Hui wasn't. I don't believe he had a time machine, but he did make a lot of really strong choices. So again, it's just one of those things where he took conscious moves. Like you were saying earlier about the Wild Lily movement. What I do remember is that the first day when he had his term, and he actually welcomed a whole pile of them into the presidential office. Inside, and he even said, I supported your goals. I support, your wants for democracy, and we'll have it in a couple months. And it did, I think, either that summer or fall that, Taiwan was when Taiwan started doing those reforms. So in terms of 1996, I just remember a lot of Taiwanese parents talking about it. But again, I am diaspora. So being overseas, even then, a lot of parents were really afraid to talk to their children about what was going on in Taiwan. So ironically, a lot of Taiwanese American friends, including myself, learned more from the news, from our history class. So I remembered when one of my high school teachers said that, Taiwan has turned into a democracy. They're just having their first presidential elections. And a couple of Chinese American students stood up and actually argued against the teacher. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that, I guess, is my experience.
Yeah, because I was here for that election, and it was really interesting to watch. People were afraid of the missiles. They were afraid China would attack. The U.S. responded by sending an aircraft carrier near Taiwan. It did not go through the Taiwan Strait, which a lot of people get that wrong.
Because of the name.
It was just in the area. It was the USS Independence, ironically enough. But there was 4 candidates. And there was Lee Teng-Hui was, of course, the KMT candidate, Peng Mingmin, who was a hero of the democracy movement and was smuggled out of the country. It's a very dramatic story and ended up in Sweden. And there was an NPP, an NP, a new party candidate. And the new party at the time was pretty big. Now they're this real extreme fringe party, but at the time they were much closer to the center. And then there was a 4th independent candidate. But Lee won with about, 56% of the vote. He pretty solidly won it. Peng Mingmin of the DPP got 20 some odd percent. I can't remember the exact number, but it was only about a quarter roughly of the electorate. So it was a very tense time because of the missiles, but it was also really kind of exciting because there was both that fear and at the same time there was a lot of optimism. And I remember talking to a lot of people, and they're like, "Yeah, we're going to vote for him, even whether they were pro KMT or even if they were anti KMT." A lot of people were voting for him because he had changed so much and done so much to bring in democracy, and they thought that this was kind of, in a sense, almost like his reward for doing that. And so they wanted to see him continue to see through his program of democratizing Taiwan. So he won quite handily, which I thought was really quite interesting.
54%, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think it was 54, yeah.
Yeah, and then I remember the Democratic Progressive Party won about 20-something. Interestingly, Frank Xie was vice president, still very active in politics. And and the new party, in 1993 was the party that split off from the KMT because they felt the KMT was losing its way under Lee Teng-Hui, actually. So yeah,
and they initially came out as kind of a non-corrupt KMT. That was really kind of their initial thing. And
or advertised that as that way, yes.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing is, the party had a broader tent early on. And then there was, in the late 90s, there was a lot of infighting. And the extreme unificationists took over the party. And a lot of the more moderate members left at that point.
Which is something I think the KMT is still paying for to this very day. I did see somebody else actually write that, because they chose not to follow Lee. I do believe if the KMT had followed Lee Teng-Hui to have a more sort of Taiwan-focused approach as opposed to a China-focused approach, that the KMT might actually still be in power to this very day. But they didn't. And therefore, it gave the DPP and other parties a wide berth. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Once I think a lot of it is he was kind of, when Lian Zhan took over as the party chair after Lee Teng-Hui left in 2000, and then the party dumped him, basically.
Yeah.
And there was that big struggle within the party, and I suspect that Lee Teng-Hui was wrong about Lian Zhan, because Lian Zhan was Taiwanese, but so I think he thought that Lian Zhan was a lot more centrist than he really was, and he turned out to be much more pro-unification and all that. So I kind of feel like Lee misjudged Lian Zhan, because you remember there was that point where he had appointed him premier, and he was like the defense secretary, and there was he held 3 different posts. So he really relied a lot on Lian Zhan, and he seemed to trust him. And, he backed him over James Song Ziyu. And that's, of course, when Song Ziyu bolted and founded the People's First Party because he was so upset. But, of course, Lee Teng-Hui had good reasons for not wanting to go with James Song, and I think part of it was that he was a mainlander. But the other was, and this is something that's not often remembered now, and this was the reason I personally did not like James Sung at all. What he did is that when he was the governor of Taiwan province, he went out and he made promises to every little lijiang out there, to every little, neighborhood borough chief, and all these promises. Oh, sure, we'll repair the dike here and we'll put in irrigation here. So he was making all these promises. It was some staggering amount of money, something like double the Taiwan provincial budget. And he basically just turned around to the central government under Lee Teng-Hui and just kind of like shrugged his shoulders and said, what are you going to do about it? And basically what Sung was doing is he was going out there and essentially buying loyalty and support all around the country as his position as the provincial governor. But he did it by basically screwing over the central government and getting them to pay for it. And I think Lee was pretty pissed with him for that.
I do think, yes, he was probably angry about that, to put it lightly.
Oh, it was a huge issue at the time. Most people forget about that now.
There is a lot of people that do say that Lee Teng-Hui actually pretended to support Lien Zan, who in 2000 was actually very unpopular.
Yeah. Well, he's not very charismatic. And as soon as, Lee had stepped down, then, Lien Zan wasn't terribly popular before, but then he, as soon as Lee Teng-Hui was no longer the KMT party chair or the president, then he just took a very deep blue turn, which made him even less popular.
Yeah, or maybe he was trying to hold on to power by appealing to the old guard. I'm not certain myself. I'm not certain about that, but I do know that no matter what, Lee Teng-Hui, by doing so, managed to tear the KMT apart in many ways. Because then you have Sung running off to his own thing. You have factional politics just exploding all over in the KMT. There was the new party now with Liao, right? And then that actually gave the DPP a great chance to win.
Yeah, and they won. They just squeaked through in that 2000 election when Chen Shui-bian won. And it was for a long time there. It was the opinion polls had it basically tied 3-way. It was really quite a dramatic election. But the pan-blue vote between James Sung and the People's First Party wasn't founded yet, because he was then just an independent.
Yeah, he was independent. Sorry, yeah, and there was the new party only won a tiny figure.
By that point, they'd shrunk.
Yeah, but Lien Zan, if James Sung and Lien Zan ran together, if the party didn't split, they would have easily trounced Chen Shui-bian.
Oh, easily in 2000, yeah. But they did come together and run together in 2004 and still lost.
By then time.
But that was 4 years later.
And there was an incumbent advantage, and of course...
And the shooting.
The shooting, yes.
There was only a tiny... the margin that he won by was tiny. And he was behind in the polls before Election Day. And then, of course, the shooting, you don't have to have a very large percentage of the population shift, in sympathy. Even if he only got, I think it was like 1% of the voting public shifted as a sympathy vote, that was enough to put him over the top.
What I personally think it was that it wasn't so much as a lot of KMTers decided, the opposition guy who I don't like got shot, so therefore I'm going to vote for him. But I definitely think it did rally a lot of Greens that might not have come out to vote to definitely come out to vote. In that case, in that kind of sympathy, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it shifted some people who were on the fence as well.
Yeah.
No, I don't think deep blue people were going to vote for him regardless.
No. I think that's in that aspect, I feel the sympathy vote worked. However, I did read articles and people saying at the time that there were KMT people that voted for Chen Shui-bian because he got shot, and I just found that very implausible.
Oh, there's lots of light blues who I could see doing that. Kind of people who might say vote for your local factional, Paul, You're
okay,
in
yeah.
Zhanghua, and you always
Yeah.
vote KMT because you're your local faction.
That definitely does happen. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're thinking of Taipei KMTers, now they're a totally different bunch. But down here in central Taiwan, we get a different brand of KMTer down here.
Oh boy.
So, all right. So we were talking about the KMT splitting. And one of the groups that split off, and they were quite big for a while, they actually had a lot of influence for a few years there, was the Taiwan Solidarity Union. And they broke away from the KMT, but they chose Lee Teng-Hui as their spiritual head. He never formally joined the party. But they were actually essentially pro-Taiwan independence. Originally, they were planned to be kind of a centrist party, but pro-Taiwan independence. And they broke away from the KMT, which a lot of people don't realize or remember today. But they were basically a lot of the KMTers who had been in the party, I think, probably just because back in the day, everybody was, if you want to get ahead. And they broke away. And they actually had some serious electoral pull for a while there.
Yeah, they were Lee loyalists. Lee Teng-Hui
Yeah, they were Lee
loyalists,
loyalists, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now that didn't really take off the way you'd hoped, though, in the long run. So, I mean, what do you think Lee's legacy is?
Well, I mean, he definitely is Taiwan's father of democracy. As you mentioned and others have, he is compared to like Lincoln, how he masterfully actually, there's another piece of legacy. It made the KMT very, very paranoid about young people or Bunsenren or what have you joining their ranks.
By the way, Bunsenren for non-Chinese speakers is native Taiwanese.
Yeah, versus the controversial phrase Weisener, which means kind of like an outsider for people. But I do think that
that's applied to the families of people who came over after 1949. Yeah,
that is correct. Yes, and if it were not for Lee Teng-Hui acting as sort of like, making all these changes that he didn't have to. He could have been dictator for life easily. He did. And he made all these masterful political moves. There were some minor mistakes here and there, but in their overall picture, the KMT still effectively hasn't really recovered. Ma Ying-jeou was sort of like a slight bip back, but to this very day, these factions are still fighting. The KMT has never got back on its 2 feet, and I don't know if it ever can. And a lot of that, actually all of that, can be attributed to Lee Teng-Hui. And then again, there's the whole election of democracy. Taiwan today would not be a freewheeling democracy if it were not for Lee Teng-Hui. Or it might have become one, but way down the line.
There's a counter argument, and that I've heard that a fair number of people believe. And I think there's some truth to it, but I don't think it's... And that is that basically Taiwan and the KMT, the reason why they finally agreed to more democratize was that the U.S. and other countries were moving closer to China, and Taiwan is a military dictatorship, under martial law or a one-party state after, was not really in the ideological camp. And so everyone was moving more toward China. And so that Taiwan basically realized that to keep the protection of the United States and good relations with other countries, they needed to democratize. And that was really the motivation behind Jiang Jingguo starting to make a few moves in that direction. Now, personally, I think that's part of the picture. I personally think that Lee Teng-Hui, actually, his heart was really in it. And he moved it much, much faster and much, much smoother than it would have gone under a different leader. I really do believe that he actually wanted to do that, not that he was pushed. But I do think that that was part of the calculus and argument that he used within the KMT to convince them to move there, rather than that was his primary motivation. I think he was using that to sell to inside the KMT as a motivator. But that he really did want to move democracy forward.
Absolutely.
But there's different opinions on this, and we don't really know.
we don't. I will say that there are people, even today, though, that try to pretend that it was Jiang Jingguo that brought democracy to Taiwan, and that wasn't really the case. Just because he called for the end of martial law and the White Terror period, did it mean that even until the early 90s there was a lot of problems? It wasn't like he flipped a switch and then it wasn't like Jiang Jingguo flipped a switch and all of a sudden the repression was gone and the secret police and so forth, and all of that was just boop, gone. No, what happened, I think, what I think is, my personal belief is that if Lee Teng-Hui wasn't there to sort of fracture the KMT, then, as you said, it would have taken a lot longer. It might not have happened, despite the very hard work of the activists in Taiwan. The reason I feel this way is because to this day, I'm not really certain if the KMT was able to fully recognize that without someone like Lee Teng-Hui actually pointing the way and pointing out that, hey, we are drastically losing supporters. We are drastically losing our position in the global stage. And one of the ways we can get around that is by actually being the and I hate this word, the quote-unquote free China as it was supposed to be. As you know, Taiwan was labeled free China, quote-unquote, for so long, even though it was just a brutal authoritarian state. And by actually going democratic, it did grab the attention of the world, at least in 1996. It was in, the front covers, at least not the front covers, but the front pages of newspapers all around the world, even the New York Times. And, because you had this democracy just growing out quite relatively peacefully from, what was one of the, I think at the time, the longest martial law in human history.
Yes, and I think that it directly led to, for example, in Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's statement, where he referred to him as the former Taiwan president. Yes. And I think that's significant, that he didn't call him the ROC president or Republic of China president or president of Free China. And I think Taiwan, I think that Lee Teng-Hui really set the groundwork for that.
Yeah.
So, all right, on that note, let's wrap this up. All right, be sure to hit like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And thank you for coming on the show, Sean.
Thank you so much for having me.
是中华民国坚定不移的严正使命，更加明确肯定，必须体认民主自由潮流，不可抗拒，健康愉快。谢谢。